If bicep curls are the most famous bodybuilding exercise that have the least carryover to athletic performance, then hip flexor exercises are the best exercises for athletic performance that have the least carryover to bodybuilding. Although some hip flexor exercises overlap with abdominal exercises, and the rectus femoris of the quadricep acts as a hip flexor and the extensor, in many cases the hip flexors go unnoticed and untrained in many strength and conditioning routines. Despite this, there is compelling evidence that the hip flexors may be highly responsive to training. Furthermore, there is evidence that they can contribute large amounts of energy to athletic movements. For instance, in sprinting, which has been well studied, roughly 1/3 of the energy is believed to come from hip flexion during the swing phase. Not to get too off topic with the issue of sprinting, because this video is about kicking. If you see some of the exercises being done on the right by Olympic sprinters, it's the swinging of the leg upwards that represents the hip flexion motion. It may seem strange to someone unfamiliar, but in the sprint motion, the swinging of the leg upwards produces energy which is conserved when the leg is brought backwards and strikes the ground. So the hip flexors produce energy even though they aren't involved much when the leg strikes off the ground. In terms of kicking, it's hard to put a number on it, but Dr. Yesis, who is a renowned sports scientist and biomechanist, said the hip flexors were particularly important when I interviewed him on this channel.
For a roundhouse, the hip flexors are the key.
When choosing exercises to train the hip flexors, whilst it's true that full range of motion sit-ups and hanging leg raises do train the hip flexors, they also make abdominal strength the limiting factor. As the hip flexors and abdominals work together in many athletic movements, it's good to train these movements to an extent. However, for a kicker, it's also very likely worth doing resisted exercises where you fire one leg at a time, as is conventional in sprint training. Because hip flexor muscle growth isn't obvious when facing someone eye to eye, some people may be skeptical of how much training effect you can get from working them out. When Japanese scientists investigated Asafa Powell, they found that his hip flexors, highlighted here on the left, were 3 times the size of an average person. For a more practical effect on athletic performance, looking at the study title displayed on screen, The Muscle Morphology of Elite Sprint Running, the scientists involved assessed the torque various muscle groups were able to produce. They assessed elite sprinters in comparison to sub-elite but competitive sprinters, in comparison to recreationally active subjects. If you look at the bars on the graph, the elite sprinters were able to produce significantly more torque with hip flexion than the sub-elite and control subjects. Looking at some of the muscles involved in hip flexion, the rectus femoris is highlighted in the anatomy photo on screen. The rectus femoris is the only one of the 4 quadricep muscles that crosses the hip joint, which makes it the only quadricep muscle capable of contributing to hip flexion as well as knee flexion. Some of the other muscles involved in hip flexion are displayed on screen here, namely the psoas minor, iliacus, and psoas major. The final point I'm going to make, which I think I have covered to an extent, is that the hip flexors are probably best trained with banded resistance and in a horizontal direction, similar to the way you see sprinters training. For a more martial arts specific exercise, you could do full kicking with some kind of resistance.